Thank you all for waking up early. I know I might be competing with puppies, so I'm kind of lucky that y'all are here, and I appreciate that. I'm excited to talk to you all today about Agile schema development. And Agile schema development is a set of guidelines for how to develop a data graph. So during this talk, we're going to discuss some of the specific practices and workflows that fall under Agile schema development. And we're going to walk through a demo that has inspiration from the real world use cases that I've run into. I'm Hauser. I'm a platform developer at Apollo, so I do full stack work on a GraphQL application called Graph Manager. It serves about 1 million requests per day, and over the past couple years, we've learned a lot from building and maintaining it. So that's where Agile schema development comes from, as well as conversations with users and customers such as yourself. A specific reason why I'm really excited to be here today is because a lot of these workflows are enabled by Graph Manager, and I'm excited to show you what we've built. For the rest of this talk, I want to focus on developer velocity. As a full stack developer, I feel like we focus on the client side of developer velocity a lot when it comes to GraphQL and the data graph. And for this talk, I want to focus on back-end developer velocity. Let's dive into some specifics. So this all falls under Agile schema development, a set of guidelines for how to develop a data graph. And there are 3 tenets that I want to focus on today. The first is shipping every day. So at Apollo, our data graph serves a bunch of different clients, including some open source ones, such as our VS Code extension and our CLI. And so every day, we get new feature requests and issues coming up, and so we need to be agile and iterate quickly on our data graph in order to support those feature requests. So how we do that is develop a single version of our graph continuously and iteratively. The next tenet I want to focus on is focusing on client needs. So in order to support, we have about a dozen or so clients who consume our data graph. In order to support them with our small team, we need to be very focused on exactly the requirements that clients are requesting, as well as maximize reuse across those different clients in order to ensure that we can keep our scope as small as possible. We also focus on documentation and making a repeatable API. An example of this is the Vue.js developer tools maintainer, Guillaume, wanted to add an engine view into the dev tools. And the only way we were able to support that is because we had a self-documenting API that he was able to spin up on without interrupting our backend development flow with too many thrown interrupts. The last tenet that I want to focus on is guaranteeing compatibility. So guaranteeing compatibility is the idea that we have these 13 or so clients that consume our data graph. And in order to support them, they're depending on us to maintain the data graph contract, our schema. And so in order to do this, we have some workflows and tools that we use to guarantee that our data graph stays compatible with existing usage, as well as a path for existing clients to upgrade to the latest and greatest. And so that's what we're going to see today. I'm going to do some live coding based on my experience, and I hope this goes well. So for this demo, we're going to use Space Explorer. This is a full-stack GraphQL application built on top of the SpaceX REST API. As a user, I'm able to browse missions. You may recognize this from our full-stack tutorial with some modifications. I'm able to browse SpaceX missions and go in and add them to my local state cart. So this is sort of an e-commerce app. And I can go into my cart and book them. And what that should do is update my booked trips. So I'm going to do that. And I wonder how long it's going to take to see them in my booked trips. So we saw there that it took a while. And what I find is that we can make this user experience better. And the only way to do that is to dive into our client-side app. So let's do that now and figure out why we saw that delay between Bon Voyage and CRS 11 showing up in our book trips. So when we dive into our front-end code base, we can see that we have a mutation here on lines 10 to 13. which is called during this mutation component. And then we see that we have a refetch queries call. And what this refetch queries call is doing is refetching the trips for the cart. So we're making two network requests, one for the mutation that gives us bon voyage, and then another for book trips. In this case, we only had one trip, so we only made one network request. In this case, we would make multiple because we're making a query for every single trip in the cart. So in order to improve this experience, we need to make a modification to our schema. And the best way to do that is to change book trips return result. So since I'm a full stack developer, I can go in the back end and do that. So let's jump into the back end. So the modification that I want to make is returning a trip update response from book trips. And what trip update response is going to do, if we scroll down, is contain a success, whether the mutation succeeded or not, as well as launches to update our cache. So I'm going to save that file and save that file with for real without selecting something. And I'm going to update the resolver to return the data that I expect. So this is success and launch IDs, which is turned into launches with the book trips update response. So I'm gonna save that. And my normal workflow is to create a commit with a reasonable commit message, add mutation response. And then I'm going to push that up to my remote and create a pull request so that I can, with a reasonable message, like add mutation response. We can go into this pull request. What this pull request is going to do is run our CI integration. So our tests as well as some Apollo checks. And this has been an example of the principle of shipping every day and optimizing as needed. So we had a direct request from the UI for some changes. And we made that. And here we see something unexpected. We see that we have a failure. And so I'm not really sure what it is. So let's click into it. So this is the Graph Manager UI. And what I'm seeing here and what this is telling me is that we are making a breaking change to our graph. And if we dig into what has happened here, during our continuous integration, we ran a service check, which takes our currently running schema on our Heroku deployed production server and takes a diff of our proposed changes. So in this case, we're changing the type of a field. And if we dig into the documentation, we'll realize that the first mutation, book trips that return to Boolean, is returning a scalar. And then what this change would do is require that we add a selection set. So any client that we have would be broken. And if we dig into this, we see that we have a web client, an iOS client, and an Android client. And if we were to make this change and push this to production, those clients would break. And this is just one of a couple dozen different change types that we can make. And so we know that we can't make this change and we have to do something different. So here's where I recommend focusing on client needs. We have a web client team, we have an iOS team, and an Android team. And I recommend that when you're developing as a backend developer, going and talking to each of these clients. So say theoretically I did that. I go and talk to them. And I realize that they all have the same requirements. They all want to update their cache based on this request. So this is a change that I want to make. And so how do I do this? I can dig into the documentation and learn that there's something called field rollover. And this is the idea that we can deprecate the existing field, so book trips, and create a new resolver. And that'll allow us to push the data graph forward, and we'll see the advantages of that as this demo continues. So let's do that now. We're going to go back over to our code and change our schema to add a new resolver called book trips with response. And then we're going to change this back to a Boolean. So this is returning it to the existing behavior. Then we're going to go into our resolvers and create our resolver to back book trips with response. And return the book trips to the existing behavior. So the final thing that we want to do is add a deprecation notice to book trips. So what this deprecation notice is going to do is tell client developers that this is no longer what they should use. So this is a directive, deprecated, and it takes a reason. I want to pause here and talk about what's important about the reason. So the reason is our messaging, our automated communication to our client developer about why we made this deprecation, and we want to provide a path forward. So there are two things in there. The path forward, use book trips with response. Which tells our client developers how to have a path forward without talking to me as the data graph developer. And then I want to tell them why, like what's the reasoning. And in this case, it's because the data returned can be used to update the cache. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to save this. And so now we have a fully documented path for our client developers to move forward. The final thing that I want to focus on is we copied and pasted this resolver. And we'll see some doc strings here. And so this is schema documentation. And I find this an extremely important part of Agile schema development because it's automating communication between our client developers and our backend developers. And so I found for every single field, I want some sort of documentation because I find that there's generally some limitations to the individual field name. So in this case, the behavior has changed. If success is false, booking failed. So now I can create a commit and push that up. Something nice like deprecated book trips. And I know you all know this is important for reviewers, so that's why I take some time. And add new field. And we're going to push that up. So this is, again, going to run our continuous integration. And we can hop back over to our pull request and wait for that to load. So this should have another cool. So while that's loading, I want to describe what inspired this. So at Apollo, we started our GraphQL journey quite early. And so we, in our mutations, decided, let's create a custom scalar called void for each mutation. And the idea was when this mutation returns, it'll throw errors if something failed. And we realized that won't support our user experience. And so gradually, we've started to deprecate those mutations that return void and add the entity that was affected by the mutation as the return type. And I encourage you all to do that over time. So as our data graph currently stands, we still have many mutations that return void because we haven't found the need to update those as time goes on. So I encourage you to do that as incrementally as you can, as opposed to in one fell swoop. We found that effective, and it enabled us to move faster than I expected. So now we see here that we've had success. And we can dig into exactly what changes we've made in order to ensure that the rest of this demo works, or our application works. So we see that we've indeed deprecated the field, and that we've added book trips with response. And now we can go back to our pull request and merge it, or in this case, squash it. Let's do that now. So what this is going to do, we have continuous deployment set up. And this is going to run the checks again. And I encourage you to include your checks in your continuous deployment pipeline. It's going to push it up to, in this case, Heroku. Could be Kubernetes, wherever you like your deployment. And then what's going to be called is an Apollo service push. And this is going to take our production schema that's running on Heroku and push that to Graph Manager. And the act of doing that will communicate out to all of our client developers that there's a new schema and new data on our data graph. And so I want to let that run, and I want to share with you all a quote that I find inspiring and powerful by Dan Borner, a distinguished product manager at Expedia. Schema validation at PR commit is a game changer. We've already detected and prevented a number of schema changes that would have led to week-long service outages for our native app customers. So I find this quote, I feel proud and inspired by it because I think it demonstrates that the work we do has been helpful to our customers and in addition to ourselves. And this comes out of a case study that we did with Expedia that I encourage you all to read. I find it inspiring, and I hope you do too. Let's jump back into let's jump back into the client side and figure out how this the service push, the pushing of a schema into the Graph Manager has affected us as a client developer. So I'm going to hop back into my client application and reload my schema. So we see something surprising. We see that there's a yellow underline warning underneath book trips. And I have some curiosity, so I'm going to scroll over it and see what's changed. And I see here that I see my documentation, my types, and I see a new message. I see that the field mutation book trips is deprecated. OK. And it tells me use book trips with response because the data return can be updated, can update the cache. Oh, sweet. OK. I know exactly what I need to do and how I can do it in order to get the latest and greatest user experience. So what if you want to run this as a like a continuous integration for your client to ensure you're on the latest and greatest and essentially lint your client? Well, in our client code base, there's something called npx apollo client check that we can run that checks all of our queries in our code base against the schema in Graph Manager. And here, again, we see the information about the deprecation. And I hope that you all are seeing that and feeling how important the documentation for that deprecation is in order to provide client developers that experience. And this is oftentimes useful for native clients that may not have access to VS Code, such as Android and iOS. The final place that a deprecation shows up is in the Graph Manager UI, the Graph Manager Explorer. So let's dig into that. So we see here that we've indeed pushed up the deprecated field as well as book trips with response. Then we can go into deprecations. And this is a screen that I like to go to a lot as a developer because we have many different deprecated fields. And I'm able to understand when I can remove a field that's not used. I really, really like pruning my schema because it means that I have to pay attention to less. And so I go in here and I see, oh, is anything unused? How has the usage changed? Are there clients that I need to go talk to? And the trick and tidbit that I found useful is isolating my deprecated fields as well as my deprecated resolvers in a separate folder and unit testing them to ensure that sort of behavior is maintained for my clients. And by isolating them, I'm able to focus on my hot path code without having to pay attention or worry about that legacy stuff. One thing that I've found useful is during tests, we run a local GraphQL server. And what I sometimes do is take the operation that the legacy clients are running and run that against my local server to ensure that sort of behavior. And the way we're able to do that is click into book trips here and go into like traces and operation signature and copy and paste that, oftentimes with like a real trace with real data. So that's how deprecations show up throughout the platform. And I can now make that change on the front end because I want to see that user experience. So let's jump in. I have to admit, this is sort of like a cooking show, and I have some changes in my stash. So I'm going to apply them, and then we're going to walk through them because I'm worried about my typing. So let's jump into those changes. So we see here we've made the update to book trips with response, with success and launches, and we can dig into how we made those changes and see that the data that we get from book trips with response we can use to update our trips. So since trips is a list, we don't know what entities are in there until we explicitly tell Apollo client what entities are in the list, which is the new launches. So let's see how that works on the front end. So if we pull up another, I kind of like Bulgaria sat1, seems reasonable, and add it to our local state cart, when we press book all, it should update immediately. Let's see. Oh no. That's embarrassing. Yeah, so we can dig into exactly why. Maybe I need to refresh it, or yeah, I'm not quite sure. But once we have all the data, we're able to make those updates and do that sort of behavioral change. Yeah, so I want to jump in and talk about exactly what we've seen here and the lessons that we've learned, because I think that's the important part. We can debug the UI all we want, but I'm going to jump back into the lessons that I want you all to pull from this talk. So the three things that we focused on was shipping every day and focusing on client needs and guaranteeing compatibility. So I want to jump into each of these three tenets specifically. So shipping every day. This is the idea that we want to maintain a single graph and optimize as needed and enable requirement changes. So what we saw today is that we had a requirement on the UI to make a change to improve the user experience. And we optimize it as needed. So we return the data that we wanted from the data graph, and we're enabling that change to happen in under 15 minutes. So our focus on client needs we were scoping exactly to current requirements for users, and we were maximizing reuse across those clients by going and talking to the web and the iOS and the Android. We also focused on schema documentation in order to make those changes apparent to client developers and automate that sort of conversation. The last portion of guaranteeing compatibility is we validated our changes against real production usage. And what that allowed us to do is understand who is using our fields, as well as make informed decisions about making those changes and going into production with confidence. Another benefit is that we're able to make more aggressive changes. So once that deprecated field becomes unused, we can remove it with confidence. We deprecated our field with a quality reason that allowed our client developers to move forward. And we hypothetically isolated and tested those legacy fields. So that's Agile schema development in a nutshell, shipping every day, focusing on client needs, and guaranteeing compatibility. A natural question in my mind is like, what's next? So I encourage you to visit the schema validation documentation. This is principle number 5 out of principled GraphQL. And there are 10 principles. I encourage you all to take a look at each one of those. There are lessons to be learned from each one, and improvements to be pulled for your best practices. And connect with me. Talk with me on the floor, on Twitter. I'm happy to chat with you all. And I'll leave you with a quote. I hope you deprecate with kindness and delete with care.